Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality. It may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we go after internalized shame. Whether it's sexual, religious, or cultural, it does a number on our mental health and our relationships. So we want to, deconstruct it as much as possible. And today I'm so excited to be interviewing Dr. Marie Thouin, which is spelled Thouin. She's the author of a book that's about to come out on June 18th. I'm so excited to get you right before it's coming out. It's called What is Compersion? Understanding Positive Empathy in Consensually Non-Monogamous Relationships. This is the first ever comprehensive scholarly book on compersion. Dr. Thouin has been featured in several magazines and podcasts, including Elle, The Savage Lovecast, and Multi-Amory. Marie has also published seminal research studies, the first encyclopedia entry on compersion, and is the creator of www.whatiscompersion.com. We will share all of this in the show notes, so just, you don't have to worry too much about that. And this is a popular website that features her research, blogs, and a list of resources on the topic of compersion. She's also the founder of Love Insight, which is a mindful dating and relationship coaching practice where she supports and guides people of all backgrounds and relational orientations to create intentional and vibrant love lives, which I love the sound of. So, and you can follow her also on Instagram at love_insight_dating. So without further ado, hello, I'm so glad to have you on the program. And I'd love for you to kind of fill in anything else in the bio, right? Like tell us a little bit more about you, where you come from, and what brings you to this topic, and what makes you interested in writing this book.
Thank you so much, Natasha, for having me on your podcast. I'm super excited and honored to be here. So yeah, a little bit more about me, Marie the human. I'm originally from Quebec, Canada. I came to the United States and the San Francisco Bay Area when I was 18. I was looking for, I would say, like my spiritual home, or a place that would feel more like home to me. I know that a lot of us don't necessarily feel home in the place where we're from, and so I feel very lucky that I was able to travel at such a young age and find a place that felt like that to me. And what I really love about the Bay Area is just how innovative people are. There is this spirit of entrepreneurship and innovation and pushing the boundaries. And that kind of connects me to my work on compersion. I was always really fascinated by different relationship structures and how people create their families, how people create their romantic lives. Are we following the templates that we've been handed, or are we being intentional and creative about those? And how? And what does it mean to create your own relationship path outside of the norm? And what does it take for it to be successful? So I naturally gravitated towards non-monogamy as a topic of personal and professional inquiry because it is so outside of the mainstream. And when I encountered the word compersion, I just really loved the concept that love could be this thing that you support people with and you support their freedom with, rather than this kind of constricted box that you have to put people in because, oh, I love you now, you have to do this thing, and we owe each other monogamy automatically. And I love the idea of monogamy or non-monogamy to be a conversation, to be something that's not taboo, to be something that we can talk about openly. So that's a long-winded answer to tell you a little bit about me and how I came to this work.
Well, I love that. We were just talking right before we started recording that I come from a conservative religious background in Mormonism. And something that I've noticed is I've worked with a lot of people, both who are maybe more progressively engaged with their religions of origin or have left their religions of origin, which we're seeing a lot of kind of in the national statistics, that non-monogamy tends to be something that is now seen as broachable. Like, are we going to consider this? Is this something we want to consider? And so I've had a lot of people, both in my clinical practice and also friendships and personal relationships, that are either conceptualizing it, contemplating it, or actively participating. And I myself, I'm pretty comfortable saying I've, been monogamish, what I call monogamish, and, conceptualizing it with my partner as well. So I think it is a beautiful and yet complicated construct, given so many of the societal things that we've been taught. And, you use this term, which is, kind of a term that's, considered kind of in the research as mononormative or monoromantic, right? Which means that most of us have been raised, especially here in the United States and Western kind of, more, what would I say, more modern cultures have been very mononormative, which, and you talk about this in the book, how a lot of even therapists and therapeutic kind of models talk about the healthy relationship, right? The ideal relationship. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Mononormativity basically means this cultural assumption that monogamy is the superior model of relating intimately, and morally superior, and also just more healthy. And I really became aware of it, I think, when I was in college. I did not grow up with this, like traditional mononormative family structure. My parents were in two different houses. They had never been married, but they also never been divorced. And they did not believe in lifelong monogamy. Let's just say that. They were more of a serial monogamist style. And so when I first started having lovers and boyfriends, I remember thinking to myself, like, why is everyone assuming monogamy? Every time that there's a connection, there's, this assumption that we're all going to be monogamous or nothing. And I remember feeling uncomfortable with it because I knew that I could love different people at the same time well. And I just wanted it to be this conversation rather than this assumption. But I, of course, encountered a lot of resistance. And that, I think, further fueled my curiosity about, well, is there a world beyond mononormativity? And what does that look like? What does that mean?
Yeah, I really love that. And I love that you kind of grew up. I think a lot of people grow up in spaces where they're not necessarily dealing with the ideal, mom and dad in the same household, but we don't really talk about it culturally other than in these ideal ways, right? So I think that's really interesting. Lots of people come from divorced families, for example, or even parents who dated, and maybe weren't necessarily monogamous in their dating experiences until maybe they partnered later on in life or things like that. So yeah, it is kind of interesting that way. Why don't we dive into, so I noticed in your book, one of the things I really liked, especially having worked with so many people, is you spent a lot of time defining compersion. But even before you defined it, you talked about not weaponizing it. So maybe you can start with a little bit of a definition of what you mean by compersion and why, as especially providers who work with folks, I think you do coaching in this space and clinical practice in this space. We don't want people weaponizing a good term. We don't want it used against people, yeah?
Absolutely.
Symmetry is now offering ketamine services. To find out more, go to simcounseling.com/ketamine-services.
So first, the definition. And for some people, like they might have never heard the term compersion. So I would define compersion in 3 different ways. And that is actually the encyclopedia definition that I co-authored with my colleague, Dr. Sharon Flicker, last year. And so the first of the 3 is compersion is the broad range of positive emotions that we might feel in relation to our partner's other intimate connections. So that's, I'm happy that you are happy with someone else. That's kind of the more traditional understanding of compersion. The second definition, however, is the broad range of positive thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors that we might experience in relation to our partner's other relationships. So that highlights the fact that compersion is not just an emotion. It definitely can be, but it can also be an attitude, a thought, or a behavior. Like, oh, I'm maybe not super excited that you're going on a date with someone else, but I'm supportive of it, and I'm going to have a positive attitude about it. The third definition is outside of non-monogamy. It's the broad range of positive emotions, attitudes, behaviors that we might experience in relation to someone we love's positive experience in any context. So my brother got a promotion. I'm super happy for him. That can also qualify as compersion. So that's the 3-part definition of compersion that I arrived at with a lot of research and conversation with colleagues. And about weaponization of compersion. So oftentimes in non-monogamous communities, compersion can be seen as this holy grail of non-monogamy. Like, oh, if you're feeling compersion, you're really a good poly person. And if you're not feeling compersion, then by definition, you would be a bad poly person. And I really started to understand that in my clinical practice as a coach, where people started coming to me saying like, hey, my partner is not feeling compersion for me when I'm going on dates. Can you fix them? Because, like I don't feel loved or supported or respected. And so, of course, we all want to feel compersion or experience compersion when we're in non-monogamy, but when we're starting to pressure other people into having an emotion, then we start potentially being controlling or manipulative rather than truly loving with that intention of making the other person feel free to experience whatever they're going to experience. And people might also weaponize compersion against themselves and come to me and say like, well, I'm not feeling compersion and I feel really ashamed that I'm not. So I actually wrote a blog called Use Compersion as a Flashlight, Not as a Stick. Meaning not as a stick to beat yourself with or as a stick to beat other people with, but use it as a flashlight to illuminate like what are the places where your relationship is really working and where it's not. Because the lack of compersion or the presence of compersion can tell you a lot about your relationship ecosystem, like the individual, the relational, and the social aspects of your relationship. So that's something we can get into more, but I just really want to warn people against the pitfall of weaponizing compersion.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's important to not weaponize even non-monogamy. Like, a lot of people might say, well, if you can't handle being non-monogamous, and that means you're closed-minded or that you're not as woke, right? Or not as, enlightened as now I am, and I see this sometimes too, even within couples who have been monogamous, where one person is maybe pressuring the other person to become non-monogamous, right? And so, yeah, these are all beautiful concepts when used without coercion,
Yes.
right? And so, I think it's a good place to start right at the beginning of our interview, that we're going to be talking about kind of some lovely ways that we can challenge our thinking, our societal structures, how we've been maybe raised to think about relationships, while also not being like, well, see, this is the way you should be, or this is the way I should be. Anytime we're shitting on each other, typically doesn't go well.
Absolutely. And I'll say, like, just like there is something called mononormativity, which we talked about, this assumption that monogamy is the superior way to relate, there is such a thing as polynormativity,
Hmm.
kind of like the orthodoxy of like, well, if you're not polyamorous, you're not as evolved.
Right.
And I think either one of those orthodoxies are unhealthy because people
Uh,
have healthy relationships in whatever structure.
yeah. Right. Exactly. And what's
Yeah.
a good fit for me might not be a good fit for you, and
Mhm.
vice versa. So I think what's lovely about all of these conversations within challenging monogamy as the ideal is that we're really looking at acceptance for many forms of relationship.
Right, right. Freedom, freedom and
Freedom.
acceptance
Yeah.
beyond the relationship structure without having it be a box.
Yes. Perfect. Okay, so when we're talking about compersion, which I love all your definitions for that, and I oftentimes start my like support groups and talking about how we typically do have compersion for other things, right? Like if
Mhm,
my
mhm,
partner really enjoys bike riding and I don't really enjoy it. If they join a bike club and go with their friends, I'm usually happy for them. That's not always the case, even with non sexual things. Like I might be jealous that my partner is spending time with their friends instead of me, or even like a promotion. Am I
mhm,
celebrating my partner's promotion, or am I feeling insecure that now they make more money than me? And am I happy about it, or am I not happy? So feelings are
mhm,
complex. Sometimes we
mhm,
celebrate with other people's success and happiness, and other times we're threatened by it. But never as much, I don't think, as in the sexual realm, right? Because
mhm,
I think
mhm,
we've been taught fairly explicitly to be jealous and to be territorial. If you listen to the love songs, if you look at the movies, if you look at so much of our media and our messages, and I think even in your book, you gave an example of even legally,
mhm,
you kill somebody in a jealous rage, you're kind of given a little bit more leeway in the
mhm.
conviction than if you are premeditated in your murder or something along those lines. So,
Right, right.
yeah, what do you want to say about kind of jealousy and what we know about jealousy?
Oh, yeah, that is such a big topic. I have a whole chapter about it in my book. And I call this chapter Developing a Non-Mononormative Relationship with Jealousy as a way to invite compersion. Because, yeah, like you said, jealousy is partially, not only, but partially a socialized emotion. I think I want to say partially because I think there is a biological component. If babies at 6 months old have been observed having jealous reactions if their primary caregiver is giving attention to another baby or even a puppet. So it's a biologically wired reaction that is meant to protect us, to protect our access to resources. And that is a good thing, like that is one of our survival mechanisms. The problem comes when we then attempt to control other people in ways that are just not kind and not respectful. Um, that's where the moral issue around jealousy arises. And I think that our mononormative culture really rests on the assumption that jealousy is the only valid response to non-monogamy and that jealousy is just a bad thing. So in my book, I explain that people who are in consensually non-monogamous relationships deal with jealousy in very different ways, and they approach it in ways that are not mononormative, meaning that they don't interpret jealousy as necessarily a lack of love or a problem in the relationship. It can be. You can ask the jealousy when you're experiencing it, like, what are you here to tell me? What's the intelligence of this jealousy? And
Mm,
it might be that there is a fissure or a break in the relationship that needs to be addressed. But it also means sometimes that, oh, there is a place that's tender in me, maybe from my childhood, maybe from feeling afraid to lose something that's important to me, but really there is not a real threat. So I can take care of my jealousy in different ways. I don't have to just blame my partner for it and control their behavior as a result of my jealousy. So I can learn to deal with jealousy in a way that is amenable to compersion, actually, because compersion and jealousy are not mutually exclusive. That's
mm.
another thing that I found.
Yeah, I really like that. And I like that you talk about it both having kind of a biological, maybe purpose, but also very much an environmental purpose. Can you talk a little bit in your book? I noticed you mentioned like some matriarchal or indigenous cultures where it's almost seen as silly to, experience jealousy because the societal construct is so different.
Hmm. Right. I mean, there are cultures and societies like the Mosuo in China who are a matriarchal culture and they are not monogamous and they are really enculturated in a very different vision of relationships and jealousy where, yeah, like they don't expect monogamy and they don't romanticize jealousy like we do in the West. I think when we look at movies or hear songs, oftentimes jealousy gets romanticized as this proof of love. If you're
Mhm.
not really in love, then you're not going to feel jealousy. So if you're not jealous, then I don't trust that you really love me.
Mhm. Mhm.
And there's also other cultures. Like I actually had a research participant in my study who was from an indigenous tribe in Canada, and she says that she was taught to not feed the seed of jealousy. If she started to feel it, even now as a non-monogamous person, if she starts to feel jealousy, she'll just kind of not feed it rather than pay a lot of attention to it and try to resolve it. She just sees it as an undignified emotion
Mm,
because she actually considers that her partner's other relationships are none of her business.
mm,
So that's a very different approach from both mononormativity, but also polyamorous culture in the way that we often encounter it in more um, how would I say, even like, it's funny to say mainstream polyamory communities because it's not really mainstream. But if you go on meetup.com and you find poly potlucks and play parties, this person who was from an indigenous lineage, she did not really relate to that. She was like, in my culture, like sex is not play. I don't want to play. I don't want a lot of details about my partner's relationships with my metamors. Like it's none of my business. So there
mm,
was more emphasis on privacy and respect and having a respectful distance
mhm.
from her partner's other relationships. So I thought
Right.
that was fascinating.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. And I like listening to other cultural perspectives because then I think we can see, oh yeah, we see lots of people kind of approaching relationships in such different ways. But then we don't, we're kind of reminded that just because we feel certain ways about relationships doesn't mean it's the way, that
Yeah.
those ways are very much usually influenced by whoever we were raised by and things of that nature. So yeah, as you talked about jealousy and compersion in a sense being in relationship with each other, you came up with a term, I think, with one of your colleagues called comper struggle. Was it Jolie Hamilton, Dr. Jolie Hamilton?
Yes, yes,
I've had
exactly.
her on my podcast as well. So I love
Hmm.
seeing that the two of you are working together. So
Yeah.
talk about comper struggle.
So yes, Jolie is a jealousy researcher. I'm a compersion researcher, and we talk a lot. So we realized that we had a lot of clients who were caught in this struggle between jealousy and compersion. They were feeling both at the same time, and they felt like it was driving them crazy because oftentimes they were feeling compersion more at the attitudinal level. They were saying like, "Hey, I really am on board with my partner's other relationships. I'm not saying that they're doing anything wrong, and my mind is in a compersive space, but my body is still feeling really threatened, and I'm feeling this jealousy. And gosh, like, how do I hold these things? What do I do? How do I resolve it? So that oftentimes can come up as a struggle because there's a dissonance between what you're wanting and what you're feeling emotionally.
Mhm.
And there can be a lot of shame in that too, especially if you are in a polyamorous community where people are very pro compersion and, like you want to be feeling compersion all the way. But to me, that's also a very generative state. When there's this dynamic tension, it can help you just be in touch with different parts of yourselves. of yourself.
Mhm.
Um, Freud talks about, the ego, the superego, and the id. I think that's an interesting model to look at jealousy and compersion coexisting together.
Mhm.
And IFS, or internal family systems, talks about different parts of our minds, not only having one mind, but having different parts. And I think that's another interesting model to look at comper struggle or the coexistence of jealousy and compersion through.
Yeah.
And just really decide, who are we going to be? And to me, behavior is actually more important than emotions, because emotions can fluctuate. And that's why I think the idea of attitudinal or behavioral compersion is very important, because even when you're not feeling compersion emotionally, you can still act with a compersion ethic or
Mm.
a compersion orientation. And that's not being insincere. That doesn't mean you have to repress jealousy or whatever else you're feeling, but that means you can actually choose to act in a way that is aligned with your values in that moment.
I really loved this component of your book because I think this happens all the time. We have a mixture of feelings for a variety of reasons. I might feel tired, but I still want to cook dinner for my children, right? Or
Mm-hmm,
I may
mm-hmm.
feel, sad, but I still want to go to the party that I was planning to go to that night, or
Yes.
so yes, I think feeling, and I think you do a good job in delineating between the natural feeling, of, oh, I am feeling compersion. It's just naturally, it just kind of came up. Like, I'm happy for your happiness. Your happiness is making me feel happy.
Mm-hmm,
You even talked about erotic compersion. Sometimes it can be
mm-hmm,
arousing. I'm like, ooh,
mm-hmm,
listening to that or watching you do something gets me all titillated and, yummy feeling. And that's hot. And then sometimes those feelings are just kind of not there at all, but I still believe in it. It's
mm-hmm,
still my values. And so then so then it's more like a skill set. It's like a skill set of compersion, which you talked about quite a bit. And you have
mm-hmm.
quite a few chapters kind of integrating how do we develop the
Yeah.
skill of compersion.
Mm-hmm,
Yes.
mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I mean, really, the main thing is creating or cultivating a fertile terrain. And I talk in my book about what are the factors that promote compersion and what are the factors that hinder compersion. So the more you can invest in fostering those factors that promote compersion, the more you're likely to experience it and to feel it. And some of those factors you might not have complete control over, such as, well, I mean, if your partner is dating someone that you just don't like or don't trust, it's going to be not that you cannot do anything about it. You can definitely try to cultivate, like, getting to know this person or see if there's anything you can do to foster the trust. But sometimes you just have to say, like, well, maybe that's not the metamor relationship where I'm going to feel the most compersion here. But there's a lot of things you can do to promote it and to cultivate it.
Are you comfortable sharing a few of those things that,
Yes,
yeah, on
yes.
both of those lists?
Absolutely. So it's split into individual, relational, and social categories,
Mhm.
and there's 6 factors total. I'll start with the factors that promote compersion. So first is the ideological commitment to consensual non-monogamy and its values. So it's actually being on board and being in a place of consent with yourself. Because I see a lot of people, on the other hand, being poly under duress
Yeah.
or feeling coerced into non-monogamy. And when you're not feeling like you can act from your own full freedom and agency, then compersion becomes pretty much inaccessible.
Yeah.
So first of all, feeling like you are on board and you're um, really committed to these values of personal and erotic autonomy, and not have love be about control and wanting that kind of diversity in your life.
Yeah.
So that's one. The second one, also individual category, is security within oneself. And that is about feeling solid within your own life, within your own soul, and having a source of love within, so that you don't feel completely dependent on your partner for everything. It's normal to feel interdependent and to have, of course, needs that we have filled by our partners. That's kind of what relationships are about. But if you don't have that inner source, it's going to be a lot more threatening to see your partner going to share time and resources and love with someone else. So you have to have that inner source, and you have to have a full plate individually.
Yeah, and I love that you bring that up because I do think it's a yes and, yes, we are reliant on relationships because we are pack animals to get some of our sense of self and self-esteem and self-worth. None of us are born on little islands where we do all that on our own. And there is this kind of, I think, responsibility for emotional maturity for us to learn how to self-soothe, how to self-regulate, how to self-feed, in a sense where we're not counting on, especially just one person to do all of that work on our behalf. Yeah. So I love that you talk about the importance of both of those, because this is another area where I see a lot of weaponization. It's like, well, see, you're just insecure. I think we're all insecure. We all have insecurities, and it's nice to have people in our corner who will affirm us and love us and build us up. And it is also, even though I don't like the weaponization of it, it is also something to look at. Like, am I, how am I doing with filling my own plate? Like you're saying. Yeah.
Exactly. And yeah, I like that you say it's both and, and that is a good segue to the relational factors, because the next factor is relational security. And that is, how safe and secure do I feel within my relationship? Is our relational plate full? Is there an abundance of love and safety and reassurance and time? Time is a big one. A lot of people, especially if they are polysaturated, they have a lot of other partners, they might feel like time is scarce. So it's harder to feel compersion if you feel like you're already not getting enough time with your partner. So that is a big one, of course. And then next is your rapport with your metamors. Metamors are your partner's other partners. So if you like your metamor, if you trust your metamor, if you already have just a good rapport or feeling of safety, and if your metamor likes you and, gives you positive feedback about your relationship with your partner, that will all really enhance compersion. Versus, I'm just going to say, the flip side of all of this now, the flip side would be if you don't trust your metamor, if your metamor gives you the impression that they would rather you not exist, of course, compersion is going to be very difficult to come to, because it's a relational thing. There has to be love and acceptance and respect in all directions. There has to be respect for each other's needs and boundaries as well.
Right. Okay, great. So, and maybe you kind of, like you're saying, maybe it's the opposite, but what are the factors that you've seen, especially in the research, hinder compersion?
So there would be being poly under duress. There would be lacking security within yourself. Feeling, like that you are constantly comparing yourself negatively to your metamors. There would be the lack of relational security. So feeling like there's not an abundance of love and time and resources, or your relationship is on the rocks. Again, there would be lack of feeling respect and trust with your metamors. There's also the lack of feeling benefits from the whole situation, from non-monogamy. So one thing that promotes compersion is also perception of benefits from your partner's other relationships, and that stokes gratitude, which is a part of compersion. But if you feel like, oh, not only is this metamor relationship not adding to the relational plate here, and I'm not getting anything out of it, but it's actually taking away, it's a net negative rather than a net positive in my life, then compersion is going to be harder than if you feel like this metamor relationship is actually helping you.
Right.
I'll give you an example. One of my study participants said that he felt a lot of compersion because his wife's partner loved dancing. And she loved dancing, but he did not. He had a bad knee and he just didn't like dancing. So he felt a relief of the pressure to fulfill all of her needs because she had another partner who liked to do things that she liked to do. And they were not competing for the same spot. So it felt like a net positive rather than a net negative.
Yeah, right. When
And the last,
it enhances instead of taking away.
exactly. And then the last factor I'll talk about is the role of community, because there's also a social factor here. And most of us live in a mononormative culture, and we have to have community of non-monogamous folks around to have role models, validate our identity, make us feel like we're not alone. If we have trouble, we can go to somebody and just be received, like in acceptance of our choices rather than being told that we're just messed up because we chose to be non-monogamous. So that is a big factor that impacts compersion, both negatively or positively, like the presence of community or the lack of community will play a large role in how much compersion people feel.
Yeah, I love that you brought community up because, first of all, and you mentioned this in the book, if you are non-monogamous, you're really part of a minority group in the United States anyway.
Yeah.
And anytime you're part of a minority group, there's going to be microaggressions, there's going to be macroaggressions, there's going to be a lot of kind of stress and fatigue that comes with that. And I think that is very much alleviated by finding community. I run a support group as like educational support group. In fact, I'm starting one on June 18th when your book comes out. So, and it's 7 weeks long. And the people who come, it's every single time I host it, it's like the first week, everybody's super nervous. It's on Zoom. Some of the people don't even open their cameras because they don't really they want the anonymity, or they're nervous, like who's going to show up in this space. It's a little scary. By week 2 or 3, everybody's cameras are on. People are sharing so many wonderful things. They're like, oh, we're, it's not like a bunch of quote unquote weirdos or something. It's like, we're all normal people, right? We're all interested in kind of similar things. We're all having similar struggles. We're all having similar celebrations. And it's just so validating to have a group of people that now you can talk to, that you can feel in connection with.
Oh, I'm so glad you're doing this. Yeah, it is a precious, precious resource. And it's oftentimes the first thing that I advise to folks who come to me for coaching and want to open their relationship from a monogamous to a non-monogamous paradigm is find friends, find community, find literature and podcasts that will help support you and feed your mind with a new ideological paradigm, because that is going to be your lifeboat when things get hard.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. You talk about compersion not necessarily being always a happy feeling. It's more like an empathic feeling. So when you have your partner maybe come home from a negative experience, or maybe going through a relationship shift, like a breakup, something that maybe isn't considered positive, that then you're able to empathize or be sad with, or, share those kinds of feelings. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. And that's a little bit of an outlier definition of compersion, but it came up enough from my participants and my research that I wanted to talk to this. Because yes, a lot of my participants said, it's not something that we can separate. The empathy for the good times and the empathy for the bad times. And when my partner comes home and has had a very painful experience in her non-monogamous life, I'm there on the same team with her to support her through that. And to me, that is part of my compersion. That is part of my really being with her and being in a role of support. So it's also an expression of that love that is not about controlling my partner, but about empowering them and wanting the best for them. So, of course, if something sad happens, then me wanting the best for them also means like, oh, I'm going to empathize with their sadness.
Yeah, which seems like a pretty normal part of relationships, right? Whether it's our friends or our family or our lovers, we mirror the things that are happening for them emotionally as
Yeah.
as a way of feeling socially connected. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another thing that you kind of bring up in this book is kind of a model for compersion. And you talk about kind of mimicking the dual control model of sexual response. That's a big, long word for what was popularized, I think, by Emily Nagoski's book, Come As You Are, where she talks about female desire and she talks about brakes and accelerators. Like, so what are the things that tend to get in the way of your sexual drive? What are the things that tend to accelerate your sexual drive, right? So maybe what accelerates my sexual drive is having all the dishes done and the kids are asleep and I've got a lock on my bedroom door. Like those might all be accelerators. And brakes might be, I don't know, feeling old shame come up or guilt for, masturbating, or maybe, I'm unemployed or I've got a big presentation tomorrow that I'm stressed out about. Those might all be breaks, that get in the way. So how do you conceptualize this for now compersion?
Yeah. Well, all of the factors that I named can be, either accelerators or brakes. And I want to say that compersion can be a trait or a state. And in psychology, that means like the trait is something that you generally feel as kind of like a way of being. And that often translates into a compersive attitude. And I've seen that a lot in older polyamorous folks who have been polyamorous for a very long time. Not always just them, but oftentimes it's very established for them. They're just compersive. They have a generally very positive outlook on their partners having a new lover. But then there's compersive state, which is the ways where it can fluctuate day by day. Oh, maybe I had a great night of sleep, so I'm more likely to feel compersion today, emotionally than tomorrow if I had a crappy night of sleep, or I didn't digest my food very well, or my hormonal cycle is in such a place that I'm feeling really teary and emotional and sensitive, and my jealousy is up. So many things can come in and press the brake or press the accelerator. Oh, maybe this is a very hot situation that I'm witnessing my partner being in, and the brakes are not on, so I'm feeling this erotic compersion, and that's an accelerator. So I think it's really helpful to conceptualize it that way, again, to kind of remove the idea that people are only compersive or only jealous. We're all, we all have brakes and accelerators.
Yeah, even make an example, like we wouldn't expect people to only be happy. We include sadness as a normal emotion. So jealousy is a normal emotion. Compersion can be a normal emotion. And people don't have to feel like, oh, this is a bad thing or a good thing. It's a thing. And then what do I want to make of that thing? What meaning do I want to make? What do I want to do with that information? Like you said, what information is it giving me?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, like I don't know anyone who is no longer ever jealous. I don't think that's the goal.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you mean by embracing a CNM identity? Again, working with a lot of folks who leave religious backgrounds, there's a lot of this idea that we're doing identity makeovers. Like we're having to reconstruct a lot of our identity, who we are, what we think about life, what is the meaning of life, what are relationships about, because a lot of those things were basically incorporated in our worldviews. So now that you have a new worldview, you are moving into new identity work. And you talk about identity work.
Yes. There is such a thing as CNM, consensual non-monogamy, identity development. Just like for LGBTQ folks, there are many models of coming out or identity development. And for non-monogamous folks, I would split them into two categories. There's people who have pretty much always felt like they were non-monogamous as an orientation. They were never comfortable with monogamy as the model. Maybe some of them have cheated in previous relationships where they were monogamous, but they didn't know there was an alternative. But when they encounter the concept of polyamory or non-monogamy, ethical non-monogamy, they light up and they say, wow, this is me. This is the true me. This is the authentic me. Thank God there is language for this. And
Yeah.
now I can go find my community. I can go find my people.
Yeah.
And the other group are the people who might come to non-monogamy not from a place of, wow, this is me, this is the real me, but rather, well, maybe my partner wants to be non-monogamous and maybe I can roll with that. It's more of a choice, it's more of an adaptation, it's more of a, lifestyle decision. And in that case, the identity development is going to look different. So for the first group who are like, let's say, non-monogamous by orientation, I just want to caveat, like, there's not science that says it's a genetic thing, but it's more of an experiential, subjective thing. The identity development is easier. And usually compersion comes a little bit easier as well, because when you feel like you're completely aligned with your values and it's really, who you are, then it's easier to get to that place of like, yes, I want everyone else to have other lovers. And I might experience jealousy, but there isn't an ideological clash. But for people who might have been, like invited or sometimes dragged into non-monogamy by their partner, and they're like, well, I could go either way. I would maybe prefer monogamy, but let me give this a try. The identity development is a little bit more complex, or sometimes it might be harder to let go of mononormativity or monogamous beliefs about love. So, I mean, everyone is different. And I kind of forgot the essence of your question.
Mainly just, what does that look like, right? Identity
Mhm.
formation in your mind. And I think you've done a fairly good job of explaining two different ways you can
Yeah.
approach identity development. So maybe one really
Right.
is about identity, and one is more like an enhancement, not so much my identity, but an enhancement to
Mhm.
my life.
Right, exactly. And like there's in the literature on coming out, both as, LGBTQ or non-monogamous, there is such a thing as coming out to yourself, which is that kind of internal process of seeing yourself differently, seeing yourself as maybe not from the mainstream paradigm of mononormativity, but seeing yourself as a non-monogamous person and excavating the shame that might come with that. And then there's the coming out to others. And that's where the role of community is so important, because when you can come out to others and see this identity reflected in a positive and accepting way, that can be very restorative and very wholesome psychologically, to say like, okay, like not only am I able to be aligned with who I feel like I am, but other people can validate that and reflect that to me. So that's a very important piece of identity development.
I love that. And I love that language. I think a lot of my listeners will really appreciate that, because we are looking at identity and how much of identity is kind of like you're saying, more kind of just within us versus it's been given to us, right? And we've just assimilated to the identity of the culture around us, or what was expected from our identities, right? So,
Absolutely.
well, before we totally run out of time, I would like to give a little bit of space for the, I don't know, kind of like more the socio-cultural, kind of the bigger perspectives. I think you mentioned in your book, and I was also concerned by several articles. I think one was in Time Magazine and one was in The Atlantic, where it talked about E&M kind of as a phase, or like, people who are rich or white, or, it just seems to be like one more thing people just like to do. And it really ignores the diversity and the richness of both polyamory and non-monogamy that is so baked into so many different parts of cultures, especially BIPOC folks, and also, regardless of socioeconomics, and also the queer community, right? And so I just wanted to give you a little bit of time to share whatever you'd like to kind of from that perspective.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. I actually start my chapter on social positionality and compersion by citing some of those articles, like that terrible Atlantic article that was called, I think, Polyamory, is it the latest fad of the ruling class?
Right.
And no, it's not. And there is something, though, to be said about the fact that oftentimes representation of polyamory is mostly kind of white, middle to upper class. And that's a lot of people that end up in research studies.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not actually representative of everyone who practices non-monogamy. So I actually did research for my book on the experience of compersion from a lens of socioeconomic status, race, gender, sexual orientation, disability status, and age. And I found a lot of really rich data about how these different identities can impact the experience of compersion. And it's very subjective, and I didn't have a large sample, so I don't have a grand theory of everything. I just want to state the limitations of that kind of research. But there's a lot of interesting trends that came up. For example, I expected that having more privilege would necessarily enhance compersion, partially based on my prior research that said things like, well, if you're more financially independent, then you might not feel as threatened seeing your partner having other partners, like you have more of this sense of inner security. But one thing that I found is actually having financial needs or even difficulties could enhance compersion, because if you have more than two adults contributing to the needs of a family and paying the rent, wow, that can be a great reason to be compersive, to
Yeah.
actually feel like you can have practical benefits from having a polyamorous family unit rather than a monogamous one.
Right.
Same thing with age. People in older age groups oftentimes had a lot more to gain by being polyamorous than people in younger age groups because they need a lot of mutual care. Same thing with folks with disabilities. So, in general, if there was a lot of community care around people's non-monogamous relationships, privilege did not really impact compersion. It's really the factors of community and the willingness to defy social convention that are more impactful when it comes to compersion rather than privileged identities or not.
Mm.
I'll give another few examples here. People who are queer or LGBTQ plus oftentimes had more ease experiencing compersion and dismantling mononormativity because they had already broken down a whole system of oppression, namely heteronormativity. They had already stepped away from that system. So questioning other systems of normativity just kind of came more easily. So they were oftentimes very compersive. And BIPOC folks oftentimes grew up in more communal cultures, so they were more likely to really know how to share. And that could apply to non-monogamous relationships, like the idea of like, oftentimes we don't necessarily learn how to share when we are privileged and therefore individualistic, and we can imagine that we can do everything on our own.
Yeah. Yeah.
So these were all sort of counterintuitive angles that I found about social positionality and compersion. On the other hand, there's also a lot of situations where maybe someone who doesn't have the means to go to parties, non-monogamous communities and parties can cost a lot of money. So if someone is disabled or does not have the financial means to buy a ticket, or perhaps they're the only person of color in a town where they would be the only non-white person in the community and they wouldn't feel totally at ease, these are places where the lack of privilege would maybe then hinder compersion because there would be less access to community and the benefits of community. So really, every situation is so unique, and there's constellations of factors that can enhance whether or not someone might experience compersion in that particular situation. But the trends I found were just not what I expected.
That's lovely. I love all of that. And I think at one point you even say compersion can kind of be seen through the lens of like social justice resistance, like like this kind of resiliency and resistance against the norms that keep so many people oppressed to begin with. So that's kind of a beautiful concept.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and actually, with an interview with Evita Sawyers, who is a Black polyamorous activist and educator, she actually first coined this term or this idea of compersion as resistance. She was talking about how oftentimes growing up with racial marginalization, you sort of absorbed the idea that you're worth less than other people or people who are white. And therefore, you can be more prey to jealousy and comparison and negative comparison with other people who maybe are more privileged in that realm. But she also observed that for some folks, compersion could serve as this act of resistance, as this defiance to a system of oppression that had been putting them down, and that kind of positive defiance and saying like, I'm going to share. I'm going to come from a place of abundance. I'm going to unite rather than separate. And that's going to be my personal relational activism in the world, or it's going to be part of it. Because I don't want to live with that mentality of, oh, I don't have enough to give because I don't have the right skin color. And I thought that was so powerful.
I agree with that. That's really beautiful. I'll make sure and share her Instagram as well in her notes. Okay, so as we're coming to the end of our time, is there anything I'm not bringing up that you're just dying to mention, or anything you feel like I missed that you're like, okay, let's make sure we get this little nugget in?
Gosh, thank you so much for asking. I feel like you covered pretty much every super important point of my book. I'll just remind people, please don't weaponize compersion. Compersion is not only an emotion, it can also be a behavior and an attitude. And just letting people know if they want to learn more about this, please read my book and join my mailing list. You can find me at whatiscompersion.com. And I also provide free 30-minute exploratory sessions for those who are interested in coaching. So if folks are just really interested in dating coaching, relationship coaching, compersion coaching, please come and talk to me.
I love it. Thank you so much. And I want to thank you for allowing me, the PDF version of your book so I could read it before we had this interview. And I would posit that reading this book for me was really a form of spiritual practice. It was really beautiful. It was really conceptualizing a lot of ideas and thoughts, and I mentioned it a lot to my partners. I was going through it, and anyway, whether you're non-monogamous or monogamous, I think just the reading of this can be so eye-opening in noticing your own emotions, noticing how you manage even something like jealousy. Because I think too, the other idea is that only in non-monogamy do you experience jealousy, but we experience all kinds of jealousies in monogamy as well. And so I think these concepts can be so helpful, even when people are in monogamous relationships. So I just found it really lovely. So thank you so much for allowing me to do that and for spending this time with me and my audience. Your time is valuable. We really appreciate you being here with us.
Thank you so much, Natasha. It's been such a pleasure having this conversation.
Absolutely a pleasure. And for those of you who are listening, just please consider supporting the podcast. You can find the podcast at natashahelfer.com, and there's a donate button there if you want to support costs like the websites and all the things that go into hosting a podcast. And otherwise, just keep subscribing and keep listening. And we thank you again, Dr. Thouin. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Na tishki say the Navajo, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. No tishki shade the Navajo, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. No tishki shade the Navajo, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart.